As of writing this video, in the spectrum of freedom in the Arab world, Lebanon ranks fairly high. Despite this, Lebanon is hardly a beacon of freedom, and its people have many long-standing grievances with a system that they just don't think works for them. Despite having elections and multiple competing political parties, Lebanon's system has not produced for its citizens a government that actually works for the people. In the 2018 elections, 49.8% of the population voted. Compared to the prior election, this is low, but it still signifies that at least half of all voters think something can be done through participating in the system. Why would people continue to participate in such a broken system? Why go through the trouble? There must be something that can be gained through putting themselves through this process. 2022 will witness new Lebanese elections. Half the population is projected to vote, with a substantial percentage open to consider the prospect. In this video, I am going to be looking into the political history of Lebanon. To do this, I will go over Lebanon's electoral system, describe the modern political paradigm, the most recent crisis faced by the country, and finally, a rundown of Lebanon's next election set for May 15th, 2022. Lebanon's system of governance is based on its constitution dating back to 1926, later amended after the country gained independence in 1943. This constitution, among many things, stipulated the creation of an elected assembly called the Chamber of Deputies, a senate representing the various sects, which was soon abolished, and a president of the republic. The president could name ministers, and the prime minister could fire anyone from his cabinet, veto any legislation while proposing his own, and was able to dissolve the parliament whenever he felt like it, and called for new elections, all while being entirely unaccountable for anything he did short of treason. During the French Mandate, the use of sectarian quotas was a part of governance, but when the French were eventually kicked out of Lebanon, the National Pact was adopted. Now, this wasn't necessarily a law or a part of the constitution, but it was treated as one, and is based on an understanding between the Maronite president, Bishar al-Khoury, and the Sunni prime minister, Riyad al-Sulh. This understanding demanded that the president be a Maronite, the prime minister a Sunni, and the speaker of the parliament a Shia. The Chamber of Deputies, in turn, was set to maintain a ratio of 6 Christian seats for every 5 Muslim seats. This status quo would change after the end of the Civil War with the Taif Agreement in 1989, in which various warlords got together in Saudi Arabia to agree to end the war. Now, there are many things I could do. I could go into a 1-hour tangent covering the entire series of events leading to and comprising the Lebanese Civil War, or I can make a video that doesn't criminally oversimplify it. If you would like to see me make a video on it, please mention so in the comments. Regardless, the war didn't end political sectarianism. It did, however, foment some minor changes. The president became weaker, and the ratio between Muslims and Christians was now 1-to-1. As the system currently stands, it works in the following way. Supposedly, every 4 years, the Lebanese people elect 128 parliament members. 46 seats belong to confessions in the Muslim category, 27 seats for Sunnis, 27 seats for Shias, 8 seats for the Druze, and 2 seats for Alawites. The other 64 seats belong to Christians, 34 for Maronites, 14 for Greek Orthodox, 8 for Greek Catholic, 5 for Armenian Orthodox, 2 for other sects of Christianity, and 1 seat for a Protestant candidate. Now, you might be asking yourself, what happens to the atheists? Well, they don't matter, and Lebanon is already too complicated, so let's just move on. Lebanon is divided into 15 electoral districts, each with a set number of seats available for the various confessions that are apportioned to that electoral district. Voters must vote for parties on a voter list, and have the opportunity to vote for the candidate on that list they prefer the most. For example, take the Saida Jazin district. Here, there are 2 seats for Maronites, 2 for Sunnis, and 1 seat for a Greek Catholic. In order for a party to win a seat in the parliament, they need to meet a certain threshold of votes, which is determined by the number of voters divided by the seats available in that district. So let's say that 50 people vote in a 5-seat district like Saida Jazin. In order for your party to win a seat, you need at least 10 votes. So far, this makes some sense. But here's where it gets even more confusing. How do they ensure that the confessions and regions are proportionally represented? First, they rank the candidates from the qualifying lists by the percentage of preferential votes they gained per their district. I'm going to borrow the percentages given from the simulation used in one of my sources. You can see here that there are different candidates and percentages for the different mini-districts that make up this electoral district of Saida Jazin. But if you take the percentages for Saida and Jazin respectively, you see that they add up to 100%. In this simulation, List A has 2 seats, List B has 2 seats, and List C has 1 seat. No matter what, this is how seats must be apportioned. They also have to give 2 seats to Saida and 3 seats to Jazin. So the people with the highest percentages are given their seats until their party reaches their seat limit. Then seats are given out based on sect. So let's say that List C has already filled out its apportioned seats, but they also have the most preferential votes for another sect. Since all of their sects are filled, this will have to go to the candidate with the next highest percentage of preferential votes in a party that still hasn't had all of the seats filled out. Potentially, you can be an elected official with less than 3% of the preferential vote. Rinse and repeat this process in all of the other electoral districts, and in theory, every 4 years you should get a parliament of 128 people. Now, they also changed the electoral system before almost every election, so you can almost never know what to expect. This parliament then elects a president every 6 years, and the president chooses the prime minister. If you're from a country that doesn't use this system, you must be thinking, man, this is confusing. And you're right, this is. In the last election, over 2% of voters cast invalid ballots. Most people in the last election were unaware of these changes to the system, which were recent. There have been many attempts to change the system and get rid of confessionalism. In 1943, the First Republic of Lebanon was formed. When the Second Republic of Lebanon was born in 1989 via the Taif Agreements, there was a stipulation which pushed for the end of the confessional division of the parliament, but this was never implemented. This change could potentially usher in a Third Republic, or at least one of the many things afflicting the Lebanese political system would be out of the way. Due to the sectarian division into Muslim and Christian apportioned seats, one would assume that this is how political parties in Lebanon organize. But you would be wrong. Political parties in Lebanon form coalitions based on what position they took during what is called the Cedar Revolution of 2005, which was a response to the Syrian occupation of Lebanon. From 1990 to 2005, the Assad family had a massive amount of influence over the Lebanese political system, with around 16,000 troops stationed in Lebanon and armed militias like Hezbollah. They influenced electoral laws in districts so that their allies can gain seats with ease. The Assad family spent millions in order to buy votes. Most importantly, they assured that the national body for the elimination of confessionalism was not formed, so as to easier divide Lebanon in order to play the various groups against each other. Christians were especially marginalized during this period of time. The most popular Christian politician, Michel Aoun, was exiled by Syria, and many Christian parties were banned. Christians were also underrepresented in unelected but important administrative positions, and thus they were the group most opposed to the Syrian domination of their country. The reason that the Assad family was able to occupy the country for 15 years after the civil war was because the Taif agreements did not give a solid timetable for Syrian troop withdrawal. Syria was also able to create multiple bilateral agreements with the Lebanese government. And lastly, the lack of backlash was due to Syria convincing the world that their presence in Lebanon was a necessary and stabilizing force. In addition, countries like the United States tacitly supported the Syrian occupation as a reward for Hafez al-Assad's support for the Gulf War, which allowed him to consolidate power. The collapse of Syria's occupation is thus traced in part to losing the tacit support of the United States in 2003, when Hafez's son Bashar, now in power, declared opposition to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. In turn, the U.S. sponsored the Syria Accountability and Lebanese Sovereignty Restoration Act in 2003, and in 2004, along with France, supported UN Security Council Resolution 1559, both of which were calls for the Syrians to withdraw their military. Lebanese politicians in exile and in Lebanon quickly saw the writing on the wall and began working against Syria in earnest. The Christian community was the first to take this opportunity and formed the Bristol Gathering, named as such because it was in Bristol, hotel in Lebanon. Standing against the Syrian occupation, they supported the implementation of the UN Security Council resolution and opposed the extension of the Syrian-backed President Emil Lahoud's term. The Druze community under the leadership of Walid Jumblat was the first Muslim community to defect from the Syrian orbit and joined the Bristol Gathering. The last community, the Sunni Muslim community, would not join this coalition until the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, who was a former prime minister. Initially, Hariri's involvement in the opposition took the form of some of the members of his political bloc meeting with the Bristol Gathering. However, Hariri was much more cautious. The stipulations of the United Nations Security Council resolution and the U.S. Act asked not only for Syrian withdrawal, but for the disarmament of Hezbollah, which Hariri thought would create a Sunni-Shia conflict in Lebanon. Later in 2004, Hariri stepped down as prime minister and continued to approach the Bristol Gathering, although still very cautiously. Despite his caution, he was still assassinated on February 14, 2005. Hariri was accused by Syria and pro-Syrian politicians of supporting the United States and France in conspiring against Syria and Hezbollah. This backfired on Syria when people began showing outrage over the assassination. The Sunni community chose to align itself with the Bristol Gathering, blaming Syria and Hezbollah for involvement in the assassination. In light of the ongoing protests against the Syrian occupation, the pro-Syrian parties in Lebanon held a rally on March 8th to show opposition to the United Nations Security Council resolution and the disarmament of Hezbollah. This, at the time, surprisingly included Hezbollah, who decided that Hezbollah shouldn't stop being armed. The Amal movement and some other small pro-Syrian parties joined in. In another rally on March 14th, leaders of the Sunni, Maronite, and Druze community renamed their coalition to the March 14th Alliance and stopped calling themselves the Bristol Gathering. This all eventually culminated in the end of the Syrian occupation on April 30th later that year. Elections were set later that May and June, seeing the March 14th coalition come out on top, with Hariri's party, the Future Movement, gaining 36 seats. Though the March 14th coalition began this new era of Lebanese politics as the dominant faction, they also underwent a decline that saw many political parties leave the alliance and join their rivals Hezbollah in the March 8th alliance. At the outset of the Cedar Revolution, the March 14th coalition included parties such as the Progressive Socialist Party, the Future Movement, the Free Patriotic Movement, Kataib, and the Lebanese Forces Party, and dominated the government. They were so dominant, in fact, they were able to approve the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which was tasked with investigating the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. Very recently, this tribunal would come to the conclusion that the assassination was connected to Hezbollah, and the March 14th coalition would, since the death of Rafiq Hariri, accuse Hezbollah and Syria of involvement. Despite their initial dominance, today they have lost their majority. Slowly but surely, many of the founding parties of the coalition would defect over to the March 8th coalition, beginning with the Free Patriotic Movement in 2006. Despite literally going to war with Syria and previously calling for the disarming of Hezbollah, Michel Aoun switched sides when the occupation of Lebanon ended. There are a variety of reasons for this. Historically, the Christian community has had more conflicts with the Sunni community as opposed to the Shiite community. Aoun also wanted to change the political system to ensure a restoration of the previous political power for Christians, which the Sunni-dominated March 14th alliance wouldn't support. Hezbollah and the Amal movement were very popular with Shiites, and by allying with them, Aoun could more easily access Christian votes in Shiite-dominated areas. Kataib and the Lebanese Forces Party, on the other hand, remain with the March 14th coalition to this day, despite both representing Christian communities as well as Aoun. These parties are first and foremost anti-Hezbollah, and were founded in opposition to Syrian unification, i.e. the unification of Lebanon and Syria. Its leaders were suppressed by Syria, and they aren't willing to forget that. They are consigned to the fact that Christians are now a minority in Lebanon and want to work towards maintaining what has been granted to them, specifically the 50% of the representation in the Taif agreements. On paper, it makes sense for these parties to ally with the future movement, but when you look at the personal histories of their leaders, it only reveals the level of insanity that it actually entails. Take Samir Jaja, for instance. As I mentioned, he leads the Lebanese Forces Party, and was jailed by Syria during their occupation. I did not mention what he was jailed for, however. In 1987, Samir Jaja allegedly assassinated then Sunni Prime Minister Rashid Khorrami. Now, the entire concept of the March 14th coalition was based on the assassination of a Sunni Prime Minister, so Jaja's inclusion is pretty nuts. In fact, even more nuts is the fact that he was accused of assassinating Danny Shamoun, who is the literal brother of the current leader of the National Liberal Party of the March 14th coalition. This confessional system has thus resulted in some of the strangest bedfellows in politics we have seen in decades. Anyway, tangents aside, the next party to leave the March 14th coalition was the Progressive Socialist Party. They left the coalition in 2009 and joined the March 8th Alliance in government in 2011. According to Jumblat, this was done due to the March 14th's unwillingness to have a political platform based in policy instead of sectarianism. However, it was more likely that this shift was done out of the desire to give more power to the minority party of the Druze. The Progressive Socialist Party is the main representation for the Druze, and it is thus wary of its minority status. It seeks to leverage its position as a power shifter by switching alliances, and is able to do so because no governing coalition would exclude the Druze for fear of being seen as illegitimate. And thus, the March 14th coalition was pushed out of government. The conflicts that have emerged between the various political parties representing the various political groups are mainly the result of the existing confessional system. It causes the different communities to fear one another and reinforces their sense of difference. This, along with the sordid history of Lebanon, makes sectarian groups fear being ruled by the other, which influences their leaders to use sectarian language and push for policies based in increasing or maintaining the amount of power of their sect. For decisions to be made, foreign powers have often had to step in order to take advantage of the chaos in order to become a power broker. After the Syrians withdrew from their role as main power broker, the obstructions for removing the confessional system went to new powers, foreign and domestic, to Lebanon. The Christian community used their position to prevent the creation of a non-confessional parliament, citing the desire to better apportion the government administrative positions and feeling owed more representation after being suppressed under Syrian occupation. Thus, they prevented the implementation of the transition away from confessionalism. Lebanon has not taken a census in literal decades, but the Christians are 32.4% of the population, while Muslims are 67.8%, essentially making the Taif Agreement apportionments obsolete. Since no group wishes to be ruled by another, this naturally causes tensions between these groups. The Sunni-Shia conflict in Lebanon, for example, is but one of the manifestations of these tensions, and has come to the forefront in the arena of politics and armed confrontations. The conflict began when the government approved a draft law for the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in 2005. Hezbollah and Amal responded by resigning from government, thus taking away the Shia representation from the government. The president at the time, Emil Lahoud, was also a holdover from the Syrian era, and wouldn't work with the newly elected government without Shia parties. The March 14th coalition folded, and the then Prime Minister, Siniora, said that Hezbollah would always be referred to as resistance. However, the Sunni-Shia conflict would continue to get worse. In 2006, after Hezbollah kidnapped 2 Israeli soldiers on the Lebanese border, Israel attacked southern Lebanon. This attack, which lasted 33 days, killed 1,109 Lebanese, most of them civilians, caused issues for Lebanon's Shia community. The trauma this inflicted on this community caused its members to believe that the March 14th alliance tacitly supported this attack. The logic being that since the alliance is backed by the US, and the US also backs Israel, that this means that the alliance could possibly have encouraged the devastating attack. Hezbollah and the March 8th alliance wanted to have a blocking third of the cabinet after this attack on Lebanon, which the March 14th alliance refused. Thus, in November 2006, the Shiite ministers resigned once again and staged a sit-in outside the government building. The Speaker of the Parliament, Nabih Berri, prevented the parliament from meeting for a whole year from 2006 to 2007, and the parties could not agree on the succession of the next president until 2008. Thus, for 2 years, Lebanon's government couldn't function. Many in the March 14th alliance also became afraid of the Shia community, in particular Hezbollah. It was thought that it wasn't fitting that Hezbollah should have a monopoly on decisions of who Lebanon is at war with, and the Lebanese army could not handle Hezbollah. Hezbollah claims to have more members than the active Lebanese army, though experts say otherwise. Regardless, Hezbollah is still a force within Lebanon, which makes its Sunni counterparts nervous. In addition, the coalition throughout the post-Syrian period faced numerous assassinations and attempts, which many attributed to Hezbollah. The Future movement, along with other parties, ensured to arm themselves in response, and this meant recruiting an armed group to aid them. It's rumored that they supported the Palestinian group called Fatah al-Islam, and this ended up failing miserably, when the group got dismantled in an armed confrontation with the Lebanese army in 2007. This all came to a head on May 7, 2008, with an armed confrontation between Hezbollah and the government after they attempted to get rid of Hezbollah's internal telecommunications network. This conflict ended on May 21st at the behest of the external powers of Lebanon, the US, France, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Syria, thus continuing the legacy of the reliance on foreign powers to allow for the government to work. Lebanon's current political and economic crisis is also a result of the failure of confessionalism. For example, from 2009 to 2018, Lebanon was governed by an unelected parliament after elections were delayed 3 times. The elections were delayed because Michel Aoun refused to adopt the electoral laws as they existed. The Taif agreements called for large electoral districts that forced people of different sectarian groups to be in the same constituency. The Free Patriotic Movement advocated for an electoral law that would have allowed Christians to vote for leaders without the influence of other sects, and it might have passed if Jaja had not chosen to side with the status quo in exchange for potentially becoming president. Without an agreement, the elections were delayed over and over again. The parties also wanted to delay the election in order to patiently wait to see the outcome of the Syrian civil war. Whether Assad or the opposition won would have signaled who had the upper hand in Lebanese domestic politics. When elections finally did occur in 2018, it left Lebanon with a parliament that was dominated by the same old parties, run by the same old familiar faces we have discussed so far, albeit with major losses for the Future movement and substantial gains for the Free Patriotic movement and the Lebanese Forces Party. Many before the elections claimed they would vote independent, but ended up sticking to the established parties. And here's the thing, I have discussed in detail how each of these parties spent most of their time squabbling with one another, but I have yet to discuss what they actually do for their constituents, and there's a reason for that. They've done literally almost nothing. Most of Lebanon's crises are a result of the Lebanese leadership, who are always able to rely on the fear their chaos engenders and a system that is designed to make sure they are impossible to remove to remain in power. The current crisis is that of Lebanon's economy, which took a serious hit in October 2019. The poverty rate went from 25% to 74%, the Lebanese pound has been devalued by 90%, and inflation between 2020 and 2021 shot up by 137.8%. People in Lebanon are hurting. The economic failure can mostly be attributed to the economic structuring of the Lebanese Republic, one which has been the foundation of its economy since its inception. Lebanon is a country dominated by a neoliberal elite that has control of the political system and uses that control in order to further push for policies that benefit them and give government contracts to members of this elite. For example, the former Prime Minister, Rafik Hariri's family, was a most important shareholder of the private corporation Solidaire. The reconstruction of the business district of Lebanon was almost exclusively given to this company, and many property owners claim that they have had their property taken from them at below market rates. Basically, it was one big scam where Hariri used his position in government to influence where these funds would land, his pocket. Saad Hariri, who took control of the party a while after his father, uses this wealth to give millions of dollars to an escort from South Africa, while he and the other politicians run their country into the ground. In many ways like this, Lebanon's financial elite dominate the politics of the country. But most importantly, they have shaped an economy based on tying Lebanon into the global market, thus relying on a mostly service-based economy rooted in banking, real estate, and finance. In 2019, it was estimated that 78.85% of the GDP was based in this. Productive sectors of the economy, like agriculture and manufacturing in turn, are very weak and minimal. Thus, Lebanon is dependent on foreign investment and remittances from the Lebanese diaspora. The government thus adopts a policy of austerity to encourage investors from abroad to finance the country. The top 10% of Lebanon's wealthy own 70.6% of the country's wealth as a result. When wealth is redistributed, it is done in a clientelist manner, thus used in ways in which each sect has its partisans use wealth to encourage supports for members of the elite. Lebanon's financial elite and their structuring of the economy made Lebanon particularly vulnerable to fluctuations in global financial markets. According to the International Crisis Group, the economy relied in part on exceptionally high interest rates to guarantee a constant inflow of fresh money to pay off previous investors, while not generating enough revenue to pay for the constantly increasing cost of the interest. As long as the financial sector didn't receive any serious shocks, Lebanon's economy could stay afloat, albeit with some serious class divisions. In 2019, Lebanon's economy received a major shock. The lack of a stable government made investors wary of investing in the Lebanese system, and the October protests in 2019 furthered this anxiety. These protests were a product of the government's audacious demand to tax WhatsApp messages, amid already depreciating conditions. Due to protests, banks closed, and the limited withdrawal of dollars, thus making people need to withdraw money in the form of the lira, which was superinflated compared to older dollar fixed rates. This spiraled into an economic collapse. The October protests spawned a movement that seeks to rival the current political establishment and was often viewed as a type of Arab Spring in Lebanon. However, this was a mostly unsuccessful protest. For example, Hariri stepped down in response to the protest and was later replaced by one Hassan Diab. When Hassan Diab shortly thereafter resigned, Hariri humbly nominated himself to become prime minister, proving it had all been one political stunt. Protests failed mainly for a few reasons. One, it occurred during a time in which COVID had become a serious issue and it discouraged people from protesting. Two, the various sects did not work together during the protests due to the economic leverage that community leaders used against their constituents. And three, there was no united leadership that prevented a united alternative vision for the future. However, despite these failures, the protests do have a chance at creating a new force in Lebanese politics. Even the Beirut port explosion was not enough to bring these disparate groups together, and it ultimately only brought the families of the victims to protest. On May 15th, the Lebanese people will go to the polls, maybe. There have been many signs that this election might not happen in the first place. Michel Aoun has attempted to build more voting centers which could potentially delay the elections, much to many other parties' chagrin. If they were to happen despite the talks about delays, it is hard to say if anything will even change at all. There is an intense amount of apathy, and as has been demonstrated, Lebanese elections are more about shifting the power arrangements of the various Lebanese oligarchs, warlords, families, and sectarian leaders than actually doing something about the Lebanese situation. However, there is a push against the system and the establishment, and whether it will succeed or not, this push must be acknowledged. Out of the 1,043 candidates, 155 are women and 88 are between the age of 25 and 35. Both are much higher than usual in these elections. And despite many voting for the establishment in 2018, polls indicate that the plurality of voters would support independents at 25.7% and 12.3% would vote for parties established in the 2019 protests. The rest support established parties. One established party that will most likely see a dip in support is the Future Movement. Saad Hariri, earlier this year in January, announced he was leaving politics, and other senior members of the Sunni community have decided not to run. This leaves a political vacuum in the Sunni community, who are a third of the population. This vacuum has prompted Saudi Arabia to act, which recently arranged meetings with members of the Sunni community. This comes after Saudi Arabia sanctioned Lebanon and withdrew its ambassador in order to punish Lebanon for criticisms made by its information minister against the Saudi assault on Yemen. What's most at stake in these elections are what might happen in regards to the economy. The IMF and Lebanon have agreed on a $3 billion loan, which will be used to pull the country out of its economic quagmire, on the condition that Lebanon make a variety of reforms to its economy. Reforms such as passing the 2022 national budget, a forensic audit of the central bank, reforming bank secrecy laws to combat financial crimes and improve transparency, and restructuring the country's banks. Lebanon needs this money, and whoever ends up in charge will be tasked with making these reforms in order to ensure Lebanon survives. There are a lot of things I covered in this video, which I was only able to briefly touch on in an attempt to make a broader point about Lebanon's relationship to its government. This is also the longest video that I've ever made. The next one will potentially be even longer. And there you go. Now you learned more than you ever wanted about Lebanon's elections. That probably won't change anything anyway. Thank you all for your time. If you want me to make even longer videos explaining even more esoteric aspects of the Middle East, please become a patron. You have a bunch of benefits. You get to see artwork I do beforehand. It makes me happy. It makes me smile. Please become a patron. I would appreciate that. I'm trying to get a new laptop. My laptop sucks. I hate it so much. It doesn't work. I would appreciate any aid in that towards that. I'm going to read the patrons. Patrons get to have their name read out at the end of every video. So lucky these people: Sailor Susie, Pyrotic Napalm, Avocado Kirby, Tom Rollins, Marshall Law, Ravignon. Thank you all so much. I love you all. You're the best. Subscribe, comment, like, and share this video. With that, I'm done forever with this video. Thank you. Goodbye.